Hello, thank you for joining me. I'm Tom Booker, the senior instructor. This is our Warrior Personal Strength lesson on Indomitable Spirit. Today we are looking at when Fred was forbidden to learn. It was 1830. Fred was 12 years old. He had made a good solid start on learning to read. He knew much of the alphabet and some words of 3 or 4 letters. But Hugh Auld had forbidden Sophia to teach Fred any longer. He said that it would unfit him to be a slave. All Fred needed to know was how to obey the commands of his master. Fred was determined to continue learning, especially if it unfit him to be a slave. But how could he manage it? How to build on the little he already knew? Sophia wouldn't teach him any longer. What did he have to work with right now? What help could he get from others? Over the next weeks, Fred thought through all of these questions. He discovered that he did have potential resources he might be able to use, but he would have to test them out to know for sure. Baltimore had opened its very first public school just a few months before. Fred couldn't be a student himself, but little Tommy Auld was old enough to go. Some of the other kids he knew in Fells Point were also students at the new public school. Potentially, they could help him keep learning. Tommy brought his spelling and reading workbooks home from school when he had finished with them. Fred looked them over carefully, doing his best to follow along with the lessons in them. He would use some of the empty spaces Tommy had left to write out the spelling lessons for himself. Now, Fred had to be careful to do this privately when he could be on his own. If Sophia saw him with a book in his hands, she would snatch it away from him and scold him. Fred would sometimes ask a few of his friends in the neighborhood who went to the new school for their help. He found a copy of Webster's Blue-Backed Speller, the same book they were using at school. Fred practiced the spelling and reading lessons in the book. When he got stuck, he traded his friends one of the biscuits Sophia baked for their help with the lessons. He sometimes practiced his lessons by writing with chalk on a curbstone or on a wooden fence. Fred also found old newspapers and pamphlets in the street that people had dropped or thrown away. He once found some pages that had fallen out of a Bible. He carefully cleaned these off and took them home with him so he could practice reading them in the loft over the kitchen where he slept. Fred also made a new friend, Charles Lawson, who worked as a drayman at a rope walk. A dray was a big, flat, horse-drawn wagon for carrying heavy loads, like barrels full of tar. A rope walk was where workmen twisted together the thick, heavy ropes for rigging the sailing ships built and repaired in the shipyards. When they weren't working, Charles and Fred practiced their reading together. Often, they would read from the Bible. While Charles was much older, Fred was better at making out the words. However, even when Fred had spelled a word out, he often didn't know what it meant. That was when Charles was able to help. He had more experience of the world and would explain words and ideas to Fred that he couldn't figure out on his own. Hugh found out that Fred was practicing reading with Charles. He was very angry and he scolded Fred. He commanded Fred to stop and threatened to beat Fred if he didn't. Fred was afraid. Hugh toiled in the shipyards. He was a big, strong adult, much bigger and stronger than Fred. Fred didn't want to be beaten. He knew it would hurt a lot. But as he turned it over in his mind, he decided that if it came to the choice of taking a beating or not learning to read, he would take the beating. Fred was more careful than ever, but he kept meeting with Charles. He kept on getting help from his friends, and he kept on practicing his reading. Hugh kept scolding him and threatening him, but never actually beat him. Fred pressed on with his efforts. By the time he turned 15 in 1833, he could read as well as any of his friends in Fells Point, and better than most. But his relations with the Auld family were now strained and tense. Hugh and Sophia both knew that Fred was secretly disobeying them, that somehow he had learned to read. But that wasn't going to be a problem for much longer. Hugh had quarreled with his brother Thomas, who was Fred's owner. Thomas had loaned Fred to Hugh and Sophia, and after the quarrel, he wanted Fred back. Thomas demanded that Fred return to Talbot County at once. Now we've got some questions about our story and about how Fred applies Indomitable Spirit. The first one, when Fred determined to continue learning, he sought out people who could help him. Some of them were the other kids in the Fells Point neighborhood who went to the new public school. Another was Charles Lawson, the drayman at the rope walk. Was Fred more likely to succeed with others to help him? Was seeking out their help to achieve a difficult goal a way of applying Indomitable Spirit? Do you think he would have learned to read all on his own? All right, second question here. Hugh Auld threatened to beat Fred if he didn't stop learning and practicing how to read. Fred was scared of him. Hugh was bigger and stronger and could really hurt him. Did being scared mean that Fred lacked the indomitable spirit it would take to learn to read? And finally, Fred decided that if it was a choice between taking a beating or not learning how to read, he would take the beating and go right on with his efforts to learn. Do you think Fred was applying indomitable spirit to face and make a tough choice? I'd like you to think those over and see what your answers to those questions would be about Fred and indomitable spirit. We'll continue this next time when Fred goes back to Talbot County and he is put into the hands of Thomas Covey, the slave breaker. A lot of indomitable spirit in that part of the story. So we'll pick back up with that next time. Look forward to talking with you again then. Thank you for joining me.